On a gray Tuesday morning in 1992, Daniel Hayes stood at the edge of swamp and watched as $600 000 excavator sink inch by inch in a black mud that refused every attempt to reclaim it. 3 days of escalating effort had failed, bulldozers snapping chains, winches tearing anchors free, cranes refusing to approach, until the only thing left was the quiet truth that power alone could not solve this. Daniel remained longer than the others, feeling not only the financial loss, but the erosion of authority, because he had built his life on decisiveness and now faced a problem that ignored it completely. Into that stillness came Elias Turner, an unhurried farmer who said he could pull the machine out, drawing laughter until he explained he would use a 1912 steam traction engine. And though Daniel dismissed the idea, Elias spoke calmly about the real issue. Not strength, but grip, not speed, but fit. And the words unsettled Daniel because they described what he had seen without understanding. With nothing left to lose, he agreed to try. When Elias returned, the engine arrived like something from another era, massive, deliberate, its steel wheels pressing into the ground instead of slipping across it. And the sight fell quiet as he walked into the mud, secured a heavy chain, and returned to the controls with steady confidence. The engine began to move with a deep rhythmic force, not violent, but persistent. And the chain tightened until, after a moment of stillness, the excavator shifted, then moved, slowly at first and then steadily, rising from a swamp, not by brute force, but by correct application, until it settled back onto solid ground. In the quiet aftermath, Daniel realized this had not been a miracle, but a match, a solution that fit the problem. And when he asked how Elias knew, the answer was simple. He understood the ground and the machine and how they worked together. And that simplicity reframed everything. A new question took root in Daniel. Not how do I overpower this, but what does this require? In the days that followed, his work changed in subtle ways. He still used modern machines, but began to look for alignment before applying force. And the results improved where they had once stalled. The story spread, and Elias became someone people called when nothing else worked. Though he never promised success, only asked questions and chose carefully when to act, proving again and again that older tools were not obsolete, only different, designed for conditions others could not handle. Daniel visited the farm over the years and saw that the true value was not the machine alone, but the knowledge behind it, the patience, judgment, and awareness required to use it well. And he watched that knowledge pass quietly to Elias's son, Samuel, through practice rather than instruction. Time moved forward and Elias eventually passed, but what he carried remained. The engine still working, the understanding still alive. And Daniel recognized that the real legacy was not a single rescue, but a way of seeing problems differently. Years later, he stood again at the edge of a similar failure, watching his grandson, Aaron, repeat the same pattern of force and frustration. And when the moment came, Daniel asked the question that had changed him, what does this require? And instead of giving answers, he allowed Aaron to see, to observe, to shift perspective, and eventually pointed him toward the same solution. When the engine returned under Samuel's care and the machine was pulled free once more, Aaron understood not as surprise, but as recognition, and the lesson continued forward, not as a story about old versus new, but as a reminder that the right solution depends on understanding the situation itself. The story settles not with an ending, but with a principle. That progress is not always about replacing what came before, but about knowing when to use it. Because some things do not become obsolete, they wait until they are needed again. In the months after the rescue, Daniel noticed the change not as a dramatic shift, but as a steady recalibration, like a compass needle settling after a disturbance. And he began to ask quieter questions before louder actions, testing assumptions against conditions rather than forcing conditions to match assumptions. Meetings grew shorter but more precise. Plans included contingencies shaped by terrain rather than theory. And crews learned to read the ground as much as the schematics, which did not slow them down, but prevented the kinds of delays that had once cost days and reputations. He still valued speed, still deployed modern equipment, but he stopped treating capability as universal and started treating it as situational. And this subtle shift created a pattern others began to notice. Projects that used a stall now moved through friction points with less resistance. Not because they were easier, but because they were approached differently. The story of the swamp traveled in fragments, told in break rooms and at job sites, each retelling trimming detail and sharpening the point, until Elias Turner became less a person and more a solution people referenced when they ran out of options. Though those who actually called him learned quickly that he did not respond to urgency alone. He responded to fit, asking about soil, load, access, what had been tried and how it had failed. And sometimes he declined, not out of doubt, but out of clarity. And other times he agreed and arrived with the same unhurried pace, preparing the engine with patience that seemed out of place in a world built on immediacy. When he worked, he did so without spectacle, each action grounded, each adjustment small but intentional. And those who watched often expected a moment of dramatic struggle that never came. Only a steady application that translated into movement where there had been none. Daniel returned to the farm occasionally, not to relive the event, but to understand the practice behind it. And he began to see that what looked simple was the result of disciplined attention. The habit of listening to subtle changes, the willingness to wait for the right conditions, and the restraint to stop before damage. And he realized that these qualities were transferable, not bound to a specific machine, but to a way of working that could be applied anywhere. He also saw Samuel learning within that rhythm, not through lectures but through shared tasks. Measuring pressure by sound and feel, judging traction by how the ground responded under weight, and making small decisions that accumulated into judgment. And Daniel recognized that knowledge like this did not scale easily, but it endured, because it lived in practice rather than in documentation. As his own company grew, Daniel began to incorporate that perspective into training, encouraging foremen to read sites before executing plans, to question whether a tool matched a condition rather than assuming it would. And while this did not replace modern systems, it complemented them, creating a balance that reduced failure without sacrificing efficiency. Over time, the idea spread beyond his company, not as a doctrine, but as a habit picked up by those who saw its value. And the question that had once felt unfamiliar became something others began to use. Quietly at first, and then more openly, what does this require? A question that did not guarantee success, but often prevented the wrong kind of effort. Meanwhile, Elias continued as he always had, tending the engine, taking calls when they made sense, declining when they did not, and allowing Samuel to take on more of the work, stepping back without ceremony as capability shifted. And Daniel understood that the true strength of what he had witnessed was not in a single outcome, but in its repeatability. The ability to apply the same principle across different situations without losing its effectiveness, because it was anchored in observation rather than assumption. And that anchor held even as everything else changed. As years passed, the distinction between knowledge and equipment became clearer to Daniel in ways that no single event could have revealed on its own, because he began to encounter problems that looked familiar on the surface but behaved differently underneath. And instead of responding immediately with escalation, he allowed himself the pause that had once felt like hesitation but now felt like awareness, using it to observe patterns that would have otherwise gone unnoticed. The way soil shifted under repeated pressure, The way machines interacted differently depending on load distribution. The way small adjustments early could prevent large failures later. And these observations did not replace his reliance on modern systems, but refined it, adding a layer of judgment that systems alone could not provide. He found that the most effective decisions were no longer the fastest ones, but the ones that aligned most closely with the situation. And this alignment often reduced the need for intervention altogether, turning potential crises into manageable adjustments. Within his company, this perspective began to shape culture, not through directives, but through outcomes, because crews saw that when they took the time to assess rather than assume, they avoided the kinds of setbacks that had once been considered unavoidable. And over time, this became a shared understanding, an unspoken standard that guided how work was approached even when Daniel was not present. Meanwhile, the story of Elias and the steam engine continued to circulate. But for those who had witnessed it directly or experienced it through similar situations, the focus shifted away from the novelty of the machine and toward the principle behind it. The importance of matching solution to condition rather than forcing a mismatch through greater effort. Samuel, now more often at the center of those calls, carried that principle forward with quiet consistency. And while he operated the same engine, his approach reflected his own experience, shaped by the lessons he had absorbed over time. And Daniel could see in him the same balance he had once observed in Elias. The ability to act decisively without rushing, to apply force without excess, and to adjust without hesitation when conditions changed. On one visit, Daniel watched as Samuel prepared the engine for a job that, at first glance, seemed routine, and he noticed the care with which each step was performed, the deliberate pacing, the absence of shortcuts. And he realized that what distinguished this approach was not just knowledge but discipline, the commitment to doing things correctly even when speed would have been easier. And this reinforced the understanding that effectiveness was not simply a matter of knowing what to do, but of consistently applying that knowledge under varying conditions. Daniel began to reflect more deeply on his own career, recognizing moments where he had succeeded not because he had more resources, but because he had, even unknowingly, aligned with the situation. And he also recognized failures where that alignment had been absent, masked at the time by effort, but revealed later through outcome. This reflection did not lead to regret, but to clarity, because it allowed him to see his experience as part of a broader pattern rather than as isolated events. And this pattern provided a framework for future decisions, one that integrated both modern capability and practical understanding. As the industry around him continued to evolve, with increasing automation and reliance on data, Daniel did not resist these changes, but approached them with a more nuanced perspective, understanding that while technology could enhance efficiency, it could not replace the need for judgment, and that the most effective use of technology occurred when it was guided by an accurate reading of conditions rather than assumed to be universally applicable. This perspective allowed him to navigate complexity with greater confidence, not because he had more answers, but because he asked better questions, and among those questions, one remained central, shaping his approach in ways both obvious and subtle. What does this require? A question that did not simplify problems, but clarified them, and in that clarity, solutions became easier to identify, not as acts of force, but as acts of fit, where the right approach emerged naturally from a correct understanding of the situation. Over time, Daniel began to notice that the most difficult problems were rarely the ones that looked complicated at first glance, but the ones that appeared simple and were therefore approached without enough attention. Because it was in those situations that assumptions went unchallenged, and it was those assumptions that most often led to failure. He saw this pattern repeat across different projects, different crews, different terrains. And each time the outcome hinged not on the scale of the equipment, but on the accuracy of the initial reading of the conditions. He started to intervene earlier, not with orders, but with questions, prompting his team to reconsider before committing. And this did not slow progress, as some had feared, but instead reduced the need for correction later, creating a workflow that felt more controlled even when facing unpredictable elements. This approach also changed how responsibility was distributed, shifting it from top-down directives to shared awareness, where each member of the crew became more engaged in understanding the environment they were working within. And this collective attention created a level of adaptability that rigid planning alone could not achieve. At the same time, Daniel remained aware that not every situation required this level of deliberation. And part of his growth was learning when speed was appropriate and when it was not, distinguishing between problems that benefited from rapid execution and those that demanded patience. And this balance became one of his most valuable skills, though it was difficult to articulate because it relied on judgment rather than formula. In parallel, Samuel's role continued to expand, and with it his own interpretation of the principles he had inherited, not altering them, but applying them in ways that reflected his own experience. And Daniel saw that this evolution was necessary, because knowledge that remains static eventually loses relevance, while knowledge that adapts without losing its foundation continues to be effective across changing conditions. During one visit, Daniel observed Samuel decline a job that others insisted was solvable. And when asked why, Samuel simply said the ground would not hold the pull. And Daniel recognized in that answer the same clarity he had once seen in Elias. The willingness to step back when conditions did not align, understanding that forcing a solution in the wrong context often created a larger problem. This reinforced for Daniel that success was not only about knowing what could be done, but also about recognizing what should not be attempted, and that restraint was as important as action in achieving reliable outcomes. As these patterns accumulated, Daniel found himself less concerned with proving capability and more focused on ensuring appropriateness. And this shift subtly altered how others perceived his leadership, not as less decisive, but as more accurate, because decisions were made with a clearer understanding of their context. Over time, this accuracy translated into consistency, and consistency built trust, both within his team and with clients, because results became more predictable not through guarantees, but through alignment with reality. And through all of this, the central question remained unchanged, quietly shaping each decision without drawing attention to itself. What does this require? A question that resisted shortcuts and demanded engagement, but in doing so provided a path that was both more reliable and more sustainable than any single tool or technique alone. The longer Daniel carried this perspective, the more he realized that many failures in his industry were not caused by a lack of capability, but by a mismatch between expectation and reality. A quiet gap that often went unnoticed until it widened into a visible problem. And he began to see that most systems were designed to perform optimally under assumed conditions, not actual ones, which meant that when those assumptions failed, the systems did not adapt. They resisted, and it was in that resistance that effort was wasted. This understanding changed how he evaluated both tools and people, because he stopped asking whether something was powerful or advanced and started asking whether it was appropriate. And that single shift influenced everything from equipment selection to team assignments, placing emphasis on compatibility rather than raw performance. He noticed that when teams were matched correctly to the conditions they faced, they required less oversight, made fewer mistakes, and adjusted more naturally to unexpected changes. And this reinforced the idea that alignment created efficiency in ways that force never could. At the same time, Daniel became more aware of how easily confidence could obscure perception, particularly in environments where success had been consistent. Because repeated success often led to assumptions that went untested, and those assumptions, once embedded, became difficult to question without a clear disruption. And for him, that disruption had been the swamp. A moment where reality refused to conform and forced a reevaluation that would not have occurred otherwise. He began to look for smaller disruptions, minor inconsistencies that signaled potential misalignment, using them as opportunities to adjust before larger problems developed. And this proactive approach allowed him to address issues early, often before they were recognized as issues at all. In conversations with other contractors, he found that this way of thinking was not always immediately accepted, because it required a willingness to slow down at critical moments, to question established methods, and to acknowledge uncertainty, all of which could feel counterintuitive in a field that valued speed and decisiveness. But those who adopted it found that it did not reduce effectiveness. It enhanced it by reducing unnecessary effort. Meanwhile, Samuel continued to refine his own approach, taking on more responsibility and encountering situations that required him to make decisions without the direct guidance of Elias. And in those moments, Daniel could see the principle in action, not as something taught, but as something internalized, guiding Samuel's choices in ways that were consistent yet uniquely his own. On one occasion, Daniel observed Samuel adjust a plan midway through execution, not because it had failed, but because he recognized a better alignment with the conditions as they revealed themselves. And this flexibility stood in contrast to the rigidity Daniel had once exhibited, highlighting the difference between following a plan and responding to a situation. This reinforced the understanding that plans were not endpoints, but starting points, tools that provided direction, but required adaptation to remain effective, and that the ability to adapt was rooted in awareness rather than reaction. As Daniel reflected on these developments, he recognized that the true impact of the lesson he had learned extended beyond any single project or technique, influencing how he perceived complexity itself. Because he began to see that complexity often arose not from the problem alone, but from the misapplication of solutions. And that by reducing that mismatch, problems could be simplified without being oversimplified, allowing for clearer, more direct responses. And through all of this, the question that had once seemed so small continued to guide him. Not as a rule, but as a lens. What does this require? Shaping not only what he did, but how he understood what he was doing. And in that understanding, he found a level of clarity that no amount of force could achieve. As Daniel moved further into the later stages of his career, he found that the greatest value of what he had learned was not in solving dramatic problems, but in preventing them from becoming dramatic at all. Because once he began to recognize patterns of misalignment early, he could redirect effort before it escalated into failure. And this shift from reaction to anticipation changed not only outcomes, but the overall pace of his work, making it feel less like a series of crises and more like a continuous adjustment to changing conditions. He also noticed that this approach reduced the emotional volatility that often accompanied difficult projects, because when problems were understood rather than resisted, they did not provoke the same urgency or frustration, allowing decisions to be made with greater clarity and less pressure. This calmness began to influence those around him, creating an environment where problems were addressed with focus rather than panic, and where solutions emerged through collaboration rather than competition, because the emphasis was no longer on who had the answer, but on what the situation required. Over time, this created a culture that valued observation as much as action. And while this did not eliminate mistakes, it changed how they were handled, turning them into opportunities for adjustment rather than sources of blame. Daniel also became more deliberate in how he shared this perspective, not through formal instruction, but through example, asking questions that guided others toward their own conclusions rather than providing answers directly, because he understood that the most durable knowledge was the kind that was discovered rather than given. In meetings, he would pause discussions long enough to ask whether the current approach truly matched the conditions. And often that pause was enough to reveal assumptions that needed to be reconsidered, leading to solutions that were simpler and more effective than the ones initially proposed. This method required patience, both from him and from those he worked with. But the results justified it, as projects became more consistent and less dependent on last-minute corrections. At the same time, Daniel remained aware that not all environments allowed for this level of reflection, and part of his continued growth was learning how to apply the principle flexibly, adjusting his approach based on the constraints of each situation, whether those constraints were time, resources, or external pressures. This adaptability ensured that the principle remained practical rather than theoretical, grounded in real conditions rather than ideal ones. Meanwhile, Samuel's work continued to demonstrate the same balance, applying steady force where needed, withholding it where it would be ineffective, and maintaining a level of awareness that allowed him to respond to subtle changes before they became significant issues. Daniel saw in this a confirmation that the principle was not tied to a specific era or technology, but to a way of engaging with problems that remained relevant regardless of context. As the industry around him continued to evolve, introducing new tools and systems that promised greater efficiency, Daniel did not reject these advancements, but he evaluated them through the same lens, considering not only what they could do, but where they fit, and this allowed him to integrate new capabilities without losing the clarity he had gained, creating a hybrid approach that combined modern efficiency with practical understanding. This balance became one of his defining strengths, enabling him to navigate increasingly complex projects without becoming overwhelmed by them, because he approached complexity not as something to be conquered, but as something to be understood. And through all of this, the guiding question remained unchanged, quietly influencing each decision. What does this require? A question that did not simplify the work, but made it more accurate. And in that accuracy, Daniel found a kind of stability that extended beyond individual outcomes, shaping not only what he achieved, but how he achieved it. Eventually, Daniel began to understand that the principle he had learned was not limited to construction or machinery, but extended into any situation where effort was applied without full awareness of context. And he started to notice the same patterns in conversations, in negotiations, even the way people approach decisions in everyday life, where the instinct to push harder often replaced the need to step back and reassess. He found himself applying the same question in these situations, not out of habit, but because it consistently revealed what had been overlooked. And this broadened the impact of the lesson beyond his professional work, influencing how he interacted with others and how he interpreted challenges that had nothing to do with physical terrain. He observed that when people felt stuck, their first response was often to increase effort, to repeat the same approach with more intensity, and while this sometimes worked, it often led to deeper entrenchment, much like the machines spinning in the swamp. And he began to see that the real shift occurred not when effort increased, but when perspective changed, when the problem was viewed from a different angle that allowed a new kind of response to emerge. This realization made him more patient, both with himself and with others, because he understood that clarity could not always be forced, that it often required time and attention to develop, and that rushing this process could obscure the very insights needed to move forward. In his interactions with younger engineers and managers, He noticed that those who adapted most quickly were not necessarily the most knowledgeable, but the most observant, the ones willing to question their own assumptions and adjust their approach based on what they saw rather than what they expected. He encouraged this mindset not by instructing it directly, but by modeling it, by demonstrating how small changes in perspective could lead to significantly different outcomes. And over time, this approach began to influence how decisions were made across different levels of his organization, creating a more resilient and adaptable system overall. Meanwhile, Samuel's work continued to reinforce these ideas in a more tangible way. As he encountered situations that required both adherence to established methods and the flexibility to deviate from them when conditions demanded it. And Daniel saw that the strength of the principle lay in its ability to accommodate both consistency and change, providing a stable foundation that could be adjusted as needed without losing its effectiveness. On one visit, Daniel watched as Samuel explained his approach to a group of workers who had come to observe, and he noticed that Samuel did not focus on the machine itself, but on the relationship between the machine and the ground, emphasizing that the key was not what the engine could do in isolation, but how it interacted with the specific conditions at hand. And this reinforced Daniel's understanding that solutions were rarely contained within tools alone, but emerged from the interaction between tools and context. As Daniel reflected on all of this, he recognized that the most valuable aspect of what he had learned was its universality, its ability to apply across different domains without losing relevance. And this realization gave him a sense of continuity that extended beyond his own experience, connecting his work to a broader pattern of understanding that had existed long before him and would continue after him. And through all of this, the question that had once been new became second nature, guiding not only his actions, but his perception. What does this require? A question that did not provide answers directly, but created the conditions in which better answers could be found. As the years continued to unfold, Daniel found that the true depth of the lesson revealed itself most clearly in moments of uncertainty, when there was no obvious answer and no immediate path forward, because it was in those moments that the instinct to act quickly was strongest. And it was also in those moments that restraint became most valuable, allowing space for observation to take precedence over reaction. He began to trust this space, not as hesitation, but as a necessary phase of understanding, where the conditions of the problem could be fully perceived before any solution was applied. And this trust allowed him to navigate increasingly complex situations with a level of confidence that did not rely on certainty, but on adaptability. He noticed that when he gave himself this space, the nature of the problem often changed, not because the conditions themselves had shifted, but because his perception of them had become more accurate, revealing aspects that had previously been hidden beneath assumptions. This shift in perception often led to simpler solutions, not because the problems were simple, but because they were being approached correctly. And this reinforced his belief that complexity was often a result of misalignment rather than inherent difficulty. Within his organization, this approach began to influence how teams handled unexpected challenges, encouraging them to pause and reassess rather than immediately escalate. And over time, this created a more resilient system, one that could absorb disruptions without becoming destabilized by them. At the same time, Daniel remained aware that this approach required discipline, because the pressure to act quickly was always present, particularly in high-stakes situations where delays could be costly. And it was in these moments that the principle was most difficult to apply, yet also most necessary, because acting without understanding often led to greater losses than taking the time to assess properly. He also observed that those who struggled most with this approach were often those who had experienced consistent success, because their confidence in established methods made it harder for them to question those methods when conditions changed. And he recognized this pattern in his younger self, understanding now that what had once been strength could also become a limitation if left unexamined. Meanwhile, Samuel continued to demonstrate the practical application of this principle in his work, handling situations with a balance of confidence and awareness that allowed him to adjust in real time. And Daniel saw that this balance was not accidental, but the result of sustained attention and practice, a skill developed over years rather than acquired quickly. On one occasion, Daniel watched as Samuel approached a situation where the initial plan appeared viable. Yet he chose to alter it after observing subtle inconsistencies in the ground, and this decision, though minor in the moment, prevented a larger issue from developing, illustrating how small adjustments based on accurate perception could have significant impact. This reinforced Daniel's understanding that effectiveness was often determined by the ability to recognize these small signals and respond appropriately, rather than by the ability to apply greater force when problems arose. As Daniel reflected on these experiences, he realized that the principle he had learned was not static but dynamic, evolving with each new situation and each new application. And this evolution ensured that it remained relevant even as conditions changed, because it was rooted not in specific methods, but in a way of thinking that could adapt to different contexts. And through all of this, the central question remained a constant guide. What does this require? Not as a formula, but as a way of engaging with a world that prioritized understanding over assumption. And in that engagement, Daniel found a clarity that allowed him to move forward with confidence. Not because he always knew the answer, but because he knew how to find it. By the time Daniel reached the later years of his life, the lesson had settled so deeply into him that it no longer felt like something he applied, but something that quietly guided him without effort, shaping his perception before it shaped his actions. And he began to notice that the question itself, what does this require, had become less about finding answers and more about removing interference, clearing away assumptions, urgency, and misplaced confidence so that the situation could reveal itself more honestly. He found that many of the most persistent problems were not difficult because they lacked solutions, but because they were approached with the wrong expectations. And once those expectations were adjusted, the path forward often became clearer. Not necessarily easier, but more direct. He also realized that this clarity was not something that could be taught quickly, because it depended on experience, on exposure to situations where assumptions failed and understanding had to be rebuilt. And this made him more patient when working with others, recognizing that each person had to encounter their own version of the swamp before the lesson could fully take hold. He saw this clearly in Aaron, whose initial resistance had gradually transformed into curiosity, and then into a form of awareness that mirrored Daniel's own, though shaped by different experiences. And Daniel took quiet satisfaction in seeing this progression, not as a validation of himself, but as a continuation of something larger than any individual. At the same time, he remained aware that the lesson would never be complete, because each new situation introduced variables that required fresh attention. And this kept him engaged, preventing the understanding from becoming static or complacent. Meanwhile, Samuel continued to operate with the same steady discipline that had defined his work. And though the engine remained unchanged in its design, its application evolved subtly with each use, adapting to new contexts while maintaining its core principles. And Daniel recognized in this a parallel to his own development, the balance between consistency and adaptability that allowed knowledge to remain effective over time. On one final visit to the farm, Daniel stood beside the engine once more, listening to the familiar sound of steam building within it. and he realized that what had once seemed like a relic of the past had, in fact, been a reminder of something timeless, a way of working that did not depend on era or technology, but on attention and understanding. As he watched Samuel prepare the machine, he felt no need to analyze or interpret what he saw, because the lesson had already integrated into his perspective, and he understood that its value lay not in explanation, but in application, in the quiet, consistent way shaped decisions over time. And as the engine came to life once more, its steady rhythm echoing across the land, Daniel felt a sense of completion, not because the story had ended, but because it had continued, carried forward in a way that no longer required his involvement. And in that continuation, he found a kind of peace, knowing that what he had learned would persist, not as a memory, but as a living practice. The question remained, as it always had, simple yet demanding: what does this require? And in its simplicity, it held the entirety of the lesson. A reminder that understanding is not something achieved once, but something maintained through attention, through willingness to see, and through the discipline to respond accordingly. And as Daniel turned away from the engine for the last time, he carried with him not the image of the machine itself, but the clarity it had brought, a clarity that would remain with him beyond any single moment, shaping the way he saw the world in ways both subtle and profound. In the end, the story did not conclude with a single defining moment, but with a quiet understanding that settled into place and remained there, shaping everything that followed without needing to announce itself. Because what Daniel had learned was not tied to the swamp or the excavator, or even the steam engine, but to a way of seeing that could be carried into any situation where effort and outcome did not align. He came to understand that progress was not always a straight line forward, not always about replacing what came before with something newer or more powerful, but often about recognizing when older methods held value that had been overlooked, and when those methods could be brought forward to meet present conditions in a way that modern solutions could not. This realization removed the false divide between past and present, allowing him to see both as part of the same continuum, where each had its place depending on the circumstances. And this perspective gave him a kind of flexibility that extended beyond his work, influencing how he approached change itself, not as something to resist or embrace blindly, but as something to evaluate in context. He also recognized that the most enduring knowledge was not the kind that depended on specific tools, but the kind that could adapt across different tools and environments, because it was rooted in principles rather than processes. And among those principles, one remained central, guiding him even when he no longer consciously thought about it. What does this require? A question that stripped away excess and focused attention on what mattered most. As time continued to move forward, the world around him changed in ways both expected and unexpected. Technologies advanced, methods evolved, and new challenges emerged. Yet the underlying pattern remained. Problems still required understanding, conditions still dictated outcomes, and solutions still depended on alignment rather than force. And somewhere, whether in a field, a construction site, or any place where effort met resistance, the same truth continued to reveal itself to those willing to see it. That effectiveness is not determined by how much power is applied, but by how well that power fits the situation. The engine in the shed remained, not as a relic, but as a reminder, and the people who knew how to use it remained as well, carrying forward a practice that did not fade with time because it was grounded in reality rather than trend. And for those who encountered the story, whether directly or through retelling, the impact was not in the spectacle of the rescue, but in the shift it suggested. The invitation to look more closely, to question assumptions, and to consider that the answer might not always be found by doing more, but by understanding better. In that sense, the story never truly ends, because it continues wherever the question is asked. Wherever someone pauses long enough to see what is actually happening rather than what they expect to happen. And wherever that pause leads to a response that fits the moment rather than forcing it. And so the final image is not of the machine or the swamp, but of that moment of recognition, quiet, unremarkable on the surface, yet powerful in its effect. When understanding replaces assumption and the path forward becomes clear. Not because it was created, but because it was seen. In that moment, the lesson completes itself, not as a conclusion, but as a beginning that repeats wherever it is needed, carrying forward through time without losing its relevance. Because some things do not become obsolete, they simply wait until they are understood.